Good morning. My name is Dee Perry, and I want to welcome you to today's program, which is the final one of a special series of Black History Month programs being presented by the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation in collaboration with Hiram College, the Cleveland History Center at Western Reserve Historical Society, and WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Thank you all for being here as part of this presentation. If you're here in the Westfield Insurance Studio Theater, then welcome to East Cleveland Shaw High School and to the Positive Enrichment program. And also, if you're watching distance learning, welcome to Jane Addams Business Career Center, Martin Luther King Career Center, Warrensville Heights Middle School, and John Adams High School. Now, to start the program, we want to introduce you to some of the people who are helping to make it happen. So take a look at the screen over here, and you'll see messages from the President and Chief Executive Officer for WVIZ PBS Idea Stream, Kevin Martin, followed by the President of the Board of Trustees for the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation, Mr. Mark Druckenbrode. You'll also hear from KeyBank Executive Vice President David M. Reynolds, speaking on behalf of our community partner and presenting sponsor, the KeyBank Foundation, and we'll wrap up with welcomes from Tracy Oliver, the Director of Media and Local Affairs for Dominion. Let's watch.
Thank you, Dee. Thank you. Welcome to WVIC Idea Stream Black History Month special program series. This series will be featuring prominent African Americans who are buried in Lakeview Cemetery. Now, the program is sponsored by the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation, the Dominion Gas, the KeyBank Foundation, and with special assistance and support from the WVIZ PBS Education Department. The program today is originating, as Dee just mentioned, from the Westfield studio at the Idea Center here at the Playhouse Square. I want to thank our very own Dee Perry of WVIZ Idea Stream for hosting and facilitating this program, and the professors from Hiram College, and to all our guest speakers for each of the 4 programs that will be featured throughout this month. All the many students that will be here throughout the series from Northeast Ohio. I also want to extend a very special thanks to Judy Kamoa Hart, the Executive Director of the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation, Mary Cromer, Director of Community Outreach for the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation, our very own Linda Williams, Senior Director of the WVIZ Idea Stream Education Department, and last but certainly not least is John Ramacone, Distance Learning Director at WVIZ Idea Stream, for the behind-the-scenes work that he's doing in creating this outstanding educational program. We hope you enjoy this series.
Thank you, Dee. Well, good morning. It's an honor to be here with you today. The Lakeview Cemetery Foundation is pleased to bring you the series of lectures on prominent African Americans buried at the Lakeview Cemetery. These individuals have contributed economically, culturally, and civically to Northeast Ohio, the nation, and the world. I'm also very honored and pleased to be collaborating with WVIZ PBS Idea Stream, Hiram College, and the History Center of the Western Reserve Historical Society. And very special thanks again to our sponsors, KeyBank Foundation and Dominion. Black History Month has become a very important part of Lakeview Cemetery's educational programming, in which we promote positive examples of historical events, exemplary leaders, and progress towards social change. This month is not only deeply meaningful for the African American community, but imperative for all of us to gain a better understanding of the nation and of the world. By reliving and remembering Black history, we create an awareness of the struggles and challenges that African Americans overcame in this country. Their perseverance serves as an inspiration for us all. Every race is connected to the rich history of this nation, and by celebrating Black History Month, everyone can be included in the tradition of acknowledgement, inclusion, and community engagement. So I thank you for your presence here today, and welcome.
Hello, my name is David Reynolds, and I'm a Senior Vice President with Key Private Bank, here representing Key Bank and the Key Bank Foundation. We are very excited to partner with Lakeview Cemetery Foundation in recognizing Black History Month and African American achievement. We at Key Bank understand the importance of diversity and consider it one of our pillars of success, internally and also externally in the Cleveland and greater Cleveland community. We believe that we should support the communities that we live and work in, and we're happy to partner with Lakeview Cemetery Foundation in its great work. We want to congratulate Lakeview Cemetery Foundation and wish it continued success. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Tracy Oliver, the Director of Media and Local Affairs at Dominion East Ohio. It's my privilege to join with Key Bank Foundation in presenting Lakeview Cemetery's Black History Month lecture series. Now, this program provides a wonderful opportunity to recognize the achievements of some truly exceptional men and women as part of our Black History Month celebration. These contributions are important regionally, nationally, and internationally. Dominion sponsored this collaboration in order to provide a unique learning experience. Through this program, we are looking to raise awareness of outstanding leaders and to expose students to people whose lives were both rich and diverse. It is our hope that the hundreds of participating students will pay close attention to the traits and the innovative characteristics of these heroes. Many of their attributes, including hard work, vision, integrity, and a determined spirit, are still vital ingredients of personal and professional success. Dominion incorporates diversity and inclusion as a key component of our business as well. Making decisions based off of multiple perspectives and a range of ideas, it just makes sense. At Dominion, we follow the guiding principles of respect, fairness, and consistency to ensure that our work environment is one in which every team member feels valued so that our corporate culture can attract, develop, and retain the best and the brightest employees. So we're proud to partner with this lecture series, and we look forward to continuing to serve our employees, our customers, and students across the region. Thank you, and enjoy today's program.
And again, thanks to all of our partners, and thank you for being here. And by the way, if you are watching via distance learning, you have a chance to participate in the conversation that we'll have later on after our presenter is finished. Send an email to townhall@ideastream.org if you have a question that you want to be part of this presentation. Again, that's townhall@ideastream.org. And now, here to tell us more about today's subjects, a father who was a literary trailblazer and a daughter who followed in his footsteps, Charles and Helen Chesnutt. We'll hear from the Associate Professor of Sociology at Hiram College, Professor Liz Piatt.
Thank you. As Dee said, I am a sociologist. So you might wonder why a sociologist is interested in a guy who wrote stories. Well, there are two reasons for that. The first is personal. Charles Chesnutt, let me advance my slide here. Charles Chesnutt is considered a Harlem Renaissance writer. The Harlem Renaissance is a period that most scholars say began in about 1915 and ended in the mid-30s. My grandfather introduced me to the poets of the Harlem Renaissance. He loved Paul Laurence Dunbar. I have an uncle whose name is actually Paul Laurence, and Langston Hughes, who is from Cleveland. And he would line me and my sisters up on the couch and recite some of his favorite poems. When I went to college, I had the opportunity to take a course on the Harlem Renaissance, and guess what? We had to read one of Charles Chesnutt's stories. The book we read was The Marrow of Tradition, and it remains one of my favorite books today, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. The second reason that I'm interested in Mr. Chesnutt should become clear as we move through this presentation. The title of my talk, The Cleveland Chesnutts, Pioneers of the Color Line, actually comes from Helen Chesnutt's biography of her father. The color line is a way that racial segregation was referred to during the time of the Chesnutts. Helen says that her father was a pioneer of the color line because he did a lot of things that no other African American person had done before. I hope that after this talk you'll agree that Helen Chesnutt was also a pioneer of the color line. And just a note, I may use the terms colored and Negro at times because these were the terms that were used to refer to African Americans when the Chesnutts were living and working and writing. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at a quote. I'm going to read this. You can follow along with me. Looking down the vista of time, I see an epoch in our nation's history, not in my time or yours, but in the not distant future, when there shall be in the United States but one people, molded by the same culture, swayed by the same patriotic ideals, holding their citizenship in such high esteem that for another to share it is of itself to entitle him to fraternal regard, when men will be esteemed and honored for their character and talents, when hand in hand and heart with heart, all the people of this nation will join to preserve to all and to each of them for all future time that ideal of human liberty which the fathers of the Republic set out in the Declaration of Independence, which declared that all men are created equal. Who do you think said that? Anybody want to guess? No guesses? Who does it sound like? It sounds like Martin Luther King, doesn't it? This was actually from a speech that Charles Chesnutt delivered in 1905. The speech was later published as an essay. Mr. Chesnutt actually knew both W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. He was good friends with both of them, even though they weren't good friends with each other. But he was writing and speaking about race before either of them. He is described as the first great African American novelist. However, his daughter Helen was a pioneer in her own right. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about her. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? That's a poem called Dream Deferred. It was written by Langston Hughes. He's one of the best known poets of the whole Harlem Renaissance. He graduated in 1920 from Central High School, where he was one of Helen Chesnutt's students. Helen was the first Black teacher in Cleveland Public Schools, where she started substitute teaching in 1902, not long after her graduation from Smith College. And the group of individuals in the picture here is her with some of her friends at the family home in 1901. She was the first Black teacher to be assigned to teach at the high school level in 1904, where she taught Latin and advised the Olympian Club, which is the Latin club. Her and two of her three siblings are in the picture on the left. In 1888, Ethel is on the left, her brother Edwin is in the middle, and Helen is on the right there. They had another sister, Dorothy, who was not born until 1891, that's why she's not in the picture. Helen graduated from Central High School in 1897. Central High School was actually the first public high school in Cleveland. It merged with East Tech in 1952, and this is a picture of Central High School in 1878. Helen went to Smith College with her sister Ethel. They had actually planned to go to Western Reserve University. Now that's Case Western Reserve University. But they decided that although at the time Case was integrated, blacks and whites could go to school there, there wasn't a lot of social integration. So students could be together inside the classroom, but outside of the classroom, it really wasn't acceptable for them to hang out with each other. So they decided to go to Smith College instead. Helen Chesnutt wrote a biography of her father that was published in 1952. There's a picture of it here. We have a copy of it in the Hiram College Library that's actually signed by her, which I think is pretty awesome. The picture of her here on the right is in 1958 at a Cleveland Public Library exhibit on her father's work. She traveled with him to Europe and parts of the United States, and the picture in the middle here is a picture of the two of them together in Yosemite. They like to travel together. From the biography, which contains many of the letters written between Helen and her father while she was at Smith College, you can tell that they were close. Charles sends a copy of one of his books, The Wife of His Youth, which is a collection of short stories, along with a biography that he wrote of Frederick Douglass. And I just want to read to you an excerpt from one of the letters that Helen wrote to her father after she received these books from him in the mail. She writes, "We received your books this week, and they are fine. Henrietta Brown sat down and read The Wife of His Youth steadily until she finished it. She says that it's the first book that has caused her to give up everything else for many a day. I don't care much for the binding, but I suppose the publishers know what they are doing. The illustrations are good, very good, except for the first one. I never cared for that. I think it will be a great success, and so do the other girls that have read it. The Douglass book is very sweet indeed. Your style is perfect. The preface is very nice. We take literature this year and are capable of judging." So she wasn't afraid to tell her father what she thought about his writing. Many people don't know that Helen was, in addition to the biographer of her father, a respected classics scholar. Dr. Michelle Ronick, whose picture is up here on the right, at Wayne State University has done extensive research on late 19th and early 20th century African-American classicists. A classicist is a person who studies ancient Greek and Latin. Helen Chesnutt is featured in an exhibit compiled by Dr. Ronick, which is currently showing at the University of California at Santa Barbara. According to her research, Helen received a master's degree in Latin in 1925 from Columbia University. And in 1932, she actually co-wrote a Latin textbook. It was called The Road to Latin. And the book was so popular that it was published again in 1938, 1945, and 1949. So she was a pretty influential person. Now let's shift gears a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit about Mr. Chesnutt. Mr. Chesnutt was born to Andrew and Ann Chesnutt in Cleveland in 1858. Andrew and Ann were free black people who met on a wagon train heading to Cleveland from North Carolina in 1856. Many black people at the time were leaving North Carolina because restrictions on free blacks were increasing. Their voting rights had been taken away. Miscegenation laws were increasing. Does anybody know what a miscegenation law is? No? Those are laws that prohibit blacks and whites from marrying. Anne had also broken the law to teach slave children to read and write. So her mother felt compelled to leave Cleveland before Anne got in trouble for doing that. Andrew was heading to Indiana to live and work with an uncle, and Anne and her mother had friends in Cleveland. Her mother bought a house at Hudson Street, and after a few months, Andrew actually came to join them. He couldn't stop thinking about Anne. They got married in 1857. They actually lived in Oberlin for a little while and were active participants in the Underground Railroad there. But they decided to go back to Cleveland to the house on Hudson Street to live with Anne's mother so that she could help them raise their children. When the Civil War began, Andrew enlisted in the Union Army. When the war was over, he was near Fayetteville, North Carolina, where his father lived. And he decided that he wanted to stay in Fayetteville. So he sent for Anne and the children. Andrew owned a grocery store, and Charles Chesnutt, this is him when he was young in school, he worked in the grocery store after school. He went to the Howard School. That's a picture of the Howard School. The Howard School was actually built by O.O. Howard, who was the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. He's also the founder of a college. Anybody want to guess what college he is the founder of? Howard University, yes. The land that the school was built on was actually purchased by 7 colored men in Fayetteville, including Charles's father. So they pooled their resources to buy the land for the school, and then Mr. Howard actually built it. When Charles was about 14, his father told him that he needed to quit school to work and help support the family. But Charles's principal, Robert Harris, didn't want him to quit school. He was a very good student. So Robert Harris gave Charles a job as a pupil teacher. So he was able to stay in school, earn some money, and keep learning. Charles wrote his first published short story at the age of 14. Anybody here 14? Are you older? Older, okay. So he was younger than you guys when he wrote his first published story. It appeared in a small weekly newspaper that was published in Fayetteville. While he was a pupil teacher, Charles spent summers teaching at remote country schools in South Carolina and North Carolina. Folks he met along the way are said to be inspiration for some of the characters in his stories, especially those in his Conjure Woman collection, which are folk tales about magic. The Conjure Woman was a witch who could cast spells and curses. In August of 1857, he writes in his journal, "These folks downstairs believe in ghosts, luck, horseshoes, cloud signs, witches, and all other kinds of nonsense, and all the world couldn't get it out of them." Charles returns to Fayetteville permanently to teach at the Colored Normal School. He got married to a woman named Susan Perry in 1878, who was also a teacher at the Colored Normal School, and they started a family. In 1880, he was appointed principal of the Normal School. But he was always learning, even though he was working full-time and raising a family. He actually took private lessons in German when he could afford it, and he taught himself French and Greek and Latin when he had learned everything he could from the tutors that were available to him. He was a pretty smart guy. By 1879, Charles had made the decision to move his family north, but he had the pressure of a growing family to support. He started teaching himself shorthand. He actually taught himself well enough that he got up to 200 words a minute. And there are some entries in his diary where you can see that his wife is really frustrated with him because he always wants her to read to him so that he can practice his shorthand. But he wanted to have another way to support his family, to make money when he moved them north. He really, though, wanted to be a writer. And this quote is from his journal on May 29th, 1880. He says, "I think I must write a book. If I do write, I shall write for a purpose, a high, holy purpose, and this will inspire me to greater effort. The object of my writings would not be so much the elevation of the colored people as the elevation of the whites, for I consider the unjust spirit of caste, which is so insidious as to pervade a whole nation, and so powerful as to subject a whole race, and all connected with it, to scorn and social ostracism. I consider this a barrier to the moral progress of the American people, and I would be one of the first to head a determined, organized crusade against it." And indeed, what makes his stories different from the white writers of the day who were writing the same kinds of stories that he did is the complexity, the humanness of both his black and white characters. Chesnutt's conjure stories really illustrate the ways in which black people subverted the system of racism and discrimination by playing into whites' beliefs about the limited abilities of black people. Charles and his family moved back to Cleveland in 1884. He took a job as a stenographer for the Nickel Plate Rail Company. And his first short story in Cleveland was published in the News Herald in 1885. It was called Uncle Peter's House. He had stories appear in a number of newspapers over the years. He got paid about $10 for each one. That's about $250 in today's value. Mr. Chesnutt also studied law under Judge Samuel Williamson, whose picture is here on the screen, while he was at Nickel Plate, and he passed the bar with the highest grades in his group in 1887. But he used his skill as a stenographer to make money. He opened his own stenography business, and it kept growing. His first major short story was called The Gooford Grapevine. You can actually Google this story, the title. It's available online on the Atlantic website, which is the magazine that it appeared in. So this story appeared in the Atlantic in 1887. He was the first African-American writer to appear in the Atlantic. But they didn't tell anyone that he was African-American until about 1899. Excuse me. The Gooford Grapevine is a frame story, which is basically a story within a story. And it introduces a character who shows up over and over in Chesnutt's conjure stories, Uncle Julius. I'm not going to tell you what it's about, because I want you to read it for yourself. But it's very entertaining. I suggest that when you read it aloud. Mr. Chesnutt was really good at capturing the way that some black people spoke during that time period. So the dialogue is really cool and interesting. And you don't really get the flavor of that unless you read it out loud. So definitely Google it so you can read it. Writing wasn't paying enough to support his family, so Mr. Chesnutt had to keep working. His stenography business was really one of the biggest in the Cleveland area. He actually provided services for a lot of conferences, conventions that came to Cleveland. Conferences and conventions that wanted to keep notes about the proceedings that happened during those conferences. In 1904, he built a house at 9719 Lamont Avenue. Anybody know where that is? It's where Charles Orr Academy is now. Anybody know where Charles Orr is? Yeah, I see some heads nodding. Okay. He wrote in the evenings when him and his wife weren't entertaining folks. But the picture up here on the right is a picture of the house that he built, and the map kind of shows you where Charles Orr Academy is today. Mr. Chesnutt had a long relationship with The Atlantic. He had a number of stories appear in that magazine. He became a pretty famous writer for his time. Two writers that he developed really good relationships with during his time were George Washington Cable, which is the guy that kind of looks like Burl Ives, if you know who that is. You guys probably don't know. And Mark Twain. George Washington Cable wrote stories that were similar to the kinds of stories that Charles Chesnutt wrote. He was very popular during the time. And of course, Mark Twain was really, really popular. One of the most well-known writers of his day. He was actually invited to Mark Twain's 70th birthday party. That was a pretty exclusive invitation, so it suggests that Charles Chesnutt was a pretty special person to have been invited to that party. I have up here some pictures of some of the books that he wrote. The Conjure Woman is a collection of short stories that came out in 1899. The Wife of His Youth is another collection of short stories. The Wife of His Youth is actually the title of one of the stories in the book. That's a story about a black man who moves from the south to the north, and he marries a light-skinned black woman. And after he gets married, a dark-skinned black woman comes to town, and guess who she is? It's the wife of his youth. So it's a very interesting story that gets at colorism in the black community. The House Behind the Cedars is a story about two siblings, a brother and a sister, who are passing. Anybody know what passing is? Passing for? Passing for white. Yeah. And what happens when they get caught passing for white? And then The Marrow of Tradition, which I told you earlier was one of my favorite books, is actually about the Wilmington riots. It's a fictionalized account of the Wilmington riots. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Wilmington riots. The Wilmington riots happened, I can't remember what 1898, that was the date. After a really inflammatory story appeared in a white newspaper in Wilmington, the editor of the black newspaper in Wilmington wrote a response to that article, and it really made white people in Wilmington upset. And as a result, some riots broke out. A mob actually set fire to the black newspaper offices. They say officially that about 25 black people died that day as a result of the riots, but they think that the number was actually a lot higher than that because there were bodies that were disposed of in the river that they were not able to count. So some scholars say that that number could be in the hundreds. So it was an incident that made the national news, and Mr. Chesnutt was really upset by what happened. So he decided to write a story about it. So it has some truth, but also some fiction. But a great, great story. I highly recommend that you read it. His collections of short stories, The Conjure Woman Tales and The Wife of His Youth, sold well enough that his publisher was convinced that he could carry a successful book. So he actually left his business to write full time. But he ended up going back to his stenography business after 2 years because his other books didn't sell as well as the short stories did. And I think that one of the reasons that happened was because those other books dealt too directly with the question of race. And people just didn't want to deal with that at the time. The last book that he published before he died was called The Colonel's Dream. That's the only one that I haven't read yet, but I'm going to do that this summer. But the Conjure Woman Tales, The Wife of His Youth, those got really good reviews at the time. Anybody know who these gentlemen are in the pictures here? I mentioned them earlier. That's a clue. Yeah, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. I mentioned that they were both good friends of Charles Chesnutt. Charles Chesnutt really, after his books didn't receive much press, they didn't sell very well, he decided to start writing really more directly about the race question in publications like The Crisis, which is the newsletter for the NAACP. He started speaking about race issues around the country, supporting the development of chapters of the NAACP. He and his wife actually helped establish the Cleveland chapter of the NAACP. The quote at the beginning of my presentation was from a speech that he gave to the Boston Historical and Literary Society, and the name of that speech was Race Prejudice. So he really did start speaking directly about the problem of race and discrimination in the United States. So he was really good friends with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. He often got caught in the middle of their arguments with each other. In 1910, Booker T. Washington did an interview in London that had W.E.B. Du Bois and some of his friends really upset. They were like all up in arms about this interview that Booker T. did. They were so upset that they decided to write a letter that was kind of like a petition. And they were going around and getting influential black people at the time to sign this petition as a way to say that they were really opposed to what Booker T had to say. Charles Chesnutt refused to sign it. Instead of signing it, what he did was he sent it back to Du Bois with a long letter outlining which points in the protest document were faulty. So he wasn't afraid to say how he felt. That's really obvious in a lot of the writing that he did. There are lots of letters in his biography where he writes to local politicians, to editors of newspapers, really using his influence as a businessman, as a writer, to draw attention to issues that were important to colored people in Cleveland. Has anybody been Charles Chesnutt helped establish Karamu House. He was one of the people that said we really need a space for African Americans in Cleveland for creative endeavors. He wrote a letter to the governor of the state because he heard that the governor was going to show in the governor's mansion, he was going to do a screening of a film called Birth of a Nation. And Birth of a Nation was a silent film that came out in 1915. It's actually credited with the resurgence or rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. It really kind of romanticizes the growth of the Ku Klux Klan. It has lots of stereotypical images about black people, especially black men. And he was really angry about the fact that the governor was going to give that film so much attention by actually showing it in the governor's mansion. So he let him know that he was not happy about that. Because of all of the writing that he did, all of the service that he provided to the NAACP, Mr. Chesnutt was actually awarded the Spingarn Medal by the NAACP. That's their highest award that they give to individuals for his literary contributions in 1928. Mr. Chesnutt was active really until he died in 1932. He really worked up till a couple of weeks before he died. He came home and said he wasn't feeling well, and a couple of weeks later he passed away. But he was very active until the day that he died, which I think is awesome. So that's what I have.
And thank you to Professor Liz Piatt. You're going to have a chance to ask her some questions in just a couple minutes. But first, we want to bring to the microphone Chad Malkamaki, who is a lead interpreter for the Western Reserve Historical Society. And Chad's brought with him some special items that'll tell us more about the lives of Charles and Helen Chesnutt.
So these are some scans of some images that we have in our manuscript collection. That's the Charles Chesnutt manuscript collection. It's about 2 boxes of materials. The first box really is correspondence from about the 1890s all the way up through the early 1930s. And we'll see some prominent figures nationally that were mentioned in the talk earlier that we have scanned in. And then the second box has, unfortunately, it was a journal that wouldn't have looked too good scanned in, but it was a journal that Charles Chesnutt took with him in 1896 to a trip to Europe, and it was some of his observations of what society was like and what interactions were like for an African American in Europe in the late 19th century. And then we also have a lot of advertisements for different speeches and plays that Charles Chesnutt went to, so we'll see some of those images on display. But this first letter is actually a correspondence from Helen Chesnutt to her father. You can see the letterhead is labeled from Smith College in Massachusetts. And when, excuse me, when you read through the letter, it's pretty much very common what you'd see any correspondence between a college-age student writing to their parents, talking about papers that she's writing for school. She actually mentions she's teaching at this time period. And then on the second page, she mentions that her and her friends are involved in plays. And I just think it's a neat connection because Charles Chesnutt, besides writing novels, short stories, he did write some theater productions. And here you have her appearing in a play at her college. But again, very typical of any correspondence between somebody in college with their parents. And here you can see her signature at the very bottom, signing to her father. The next document we have is some of his activism. So here is a letter that Charles Chesnutt received from the congressperson, Theodore Burton. He was the congressperson for the east side of Cleveland. Eventually this would be the congressional seat that would be part of the district that Louis Stokes would hold for over 30 years. And then continue to, it's basically Marcia Fudge is our current congresswoman. It's her congressional seat on the east side of Cleveland. But this is correspondence from the year 1921. And it's in regards to a letter that Charles Chesnutt sent to Congressman Burton about anti-lynching legislation that was up at the federal level. So again, it just is a real nice connection between his activism and getting a hold of his congressperson and letting him know how he felt about legislation that's on the current floor. And here we have a letter from Walter White, who was the acting secretary and eventually was president of the National Association for Colored People. And this is, again, from 1923, and he's thanking Charles Chesnutt for his annual membership contributions to the NAACP, but he's also asking him about what the NAACP is actually doing. And the second paragraph mainly talks about men that were on trial for a riot that was occurred, so it was their defense of those individuals. In the third paragraph, you have continued information about anti-lynching legislation. So again, this is one of the directors of the NAACP who would eventually serve as president of the NAACP for over 30 years, and again, Chesnutt interacting and being involved with national legislation that's on the books. The next item was from another person that was part of this lecture series. Her name is Jane Edna Hunter, and she was part of an organization known as the Phyllis Wheatley Association. And this is a document from 1930, and again, it's her acknowledging Charles Chesnutt's contributions to the Phyllis Wheatley Association, which was a training facility, but it also provided housing for young women as they were coming to Cleveland, especially as they were part of the Great Migration from the South. A lot of young African-American women couldn't find safe housing, and that was one thing the Phyllis Wheatley Association provided. And in Jane Edna Hunter's papers that we also have at the museum, we have some correspondence from Charles Chesnutt, and it's interesting that you get to see what Charles Chesnutt's writing to her as well as her writing, and they actually hosted, Charles Chesnutt and his wife hosted a fundraiser for the Phyllis Wheatley Association at their home. The next item is an advertisement, and this is from the second container in the manuscript collection. And this was published by his publishers of his different works, but it was for lecture series, another way to gain money for the family, that he would travel around the country and give talks. And you have some of, when you look into detail, it gives details of the different works that he writes. On the right side, you can see what some publications and critics were writing about the Conjurer Woman. You also have the wife of his youth, so these are some of the stories that you heard about earlier in the lecture, and this is just some of the national magazines and publications that reviewed his stories, but it was acclamation that they gave, so he could go and give talks around the country. And then the last piece that we scanned in was a piece from a performance for the 30th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation given at the Gray's Armory, and it was a fundraiser for the Cleveland Home for Aged Colored People, which is still around today. It's a nursing facility for senior citizens, but this was a performance, and Charles Chesnutt is listed as the main historian that did the research and provided the historical context for this play. But it went back and looked at, in 3 acts, what life was like under slavery, then what life was like under freedom, and then continuing how people gained education later on in the 19th century. And it's really hard to see, but it's right at the top, right under performers, on that first line where you see Charles Chesnutt's name. It's listed as C.W. Chesnutt, but he's the lead historian for this presentation. And again, it was a fundraiser for a group that's still around. So again, it's his work in the community that we have. But thank you for letting us share some of these items. And this is just, I think it's 10 items from over 3,000 pieces of correspondence and materials that we have in the Charles Chesnutt collection at the Cleveland History Center at the Western Reserve Historical Society. Thank you.
And thanks again to Chad Malkamaki. And what happens now is that you get a chance to ask questions about Charles and Helen Chesnutt, and you can get some idea about the times in which they lived and what they accomplished. And let me remind you, if you're watching from distance learning, you still have time to get in an email, townhall@ideastream.org. That's townhall@ideastream.org. And if Professor Piatt would join me at the microphone.
Does anyone have a question? I can come to the
right there. No one ready with a question yet? Okay, I have one I'll start with. And Professor Piatt, you mentioned some of the writings of Charles Chesnutt, and in those, I realized that he created characters who were, like himself, very light-skinned black people. What can you see in his writing about his thoughts on the subject of passing?
I think that he, based on what he's written, especially if you look at stories like The House in the Cedars, he recognized that for some black people it was necessary, that the only way that they could achieve, given the environment, was to pass as white. But he also recognized the danger of doing that. And he could have done it. He was fair enough that he could pass as white, but he thought it was more important to speak for people of color during the time as a person of color.
You also talked about his sometimes being in the middle between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. In their time, what were Washington's and Du Bois's public statements about what black people should be, could be, and where did Charles Chesnutt fall in that spectrum?
That's a really good question. So the kind of classic debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois was about how black people should go about achieving given the environment that they were in. Du Bois always said that we should focus on the most talented black people in the community, make sure that they get a lot of education. They should come north where they had more advantages to do that. And then start doing things in industries where black people were underrepresented, like medicine and law and education. Booker T. Washington said, cast down your bucket where you are. He said black people should stay in the South. They knew the South, they knew agriculture, so they should do things like develop their own farms, really build up the industry in the South as far as agriculture was concerned. So they were both interested in the elevation of black people, but they just had very different approaches to that. So Du Bois was much more kind of radical for the day. And Chesnutt really said, we can do both of these things. It's not an either or kind of deal. We can do both, and we should be doing both. So he was often the mediator between Washington and Du Bois.
And in the quote that you read earlier in your presentation, he talked about writing to elevate the consciousness of white people, which made me curious about who the audience was who was buying his books and articles.
Yeah, the audience was whites. And that's why his stories that dealt more directly with the race question didn't sell as well, because whites weren't ready to hear what he had to say about race. So they were much more interested in his more popular stories that were in the same genre as George Washington Gable, for example. So
like
they focused on the folk tales, tales about magic and witchcraft that were really popular during the time. They loved those, but the other stories just dealt too directly with race and the position of black people and the ways that whites were really complicit in the discrimination of blacks. So they just were not very popular.
Anybody want to step to the mic and ask your own personal question? No? All right, then I'll keep on going. You started by talking about your role as a sociologist and your love of Charles Chesnutt. Go back a little bit and explain what sociology studies and what that connection is with the Chesnutts.
There's a sociologist, I call him one of the dead white guys. His name is C. Wright Mills. He's considered one of the founders of sociology. And one thing that he said is that sociology is the study of the intersection of history and biography. So sociology is really about understanding how the context that we find ourselves in affects our behavior or our own biography, our own actions, and how our own actions can affect our history or the context in which we find ourselves. So sociologists are really interested in history and how it shapes human behavior. There are lots of sociologists that are actually historical sociologists. So, for example, there's a sociologist who has gone back into sociological record to actually establish that W.E.B. Du Bois actually established the first academic program in sociology at Clark University. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it is.
So for a long time, we thought that these dead white guys were the founders of sociology, like Marx and Weber and Durkheim. But really, it was Du Bois who started sociology. And Charles Chesnutt, he's dealing with race. That's something that I'm really interested in. My work really looks at how race continues to shape the experience of people of color as far as their physical and mental health. So anybody who talks about race is going to be relevant for a sociologist, I think.
Right. Okay. I'm wondering about Helen Chesnutt because she's part of this presentation too, and also there seemed to be a bond, especially between Charles and Helen. What the role of Charles's wife Susan was, and the other children, if they carried on his mantle as well.
That's a good question. I don't know a lot about his other children. His wife was really involved in the Colored Women's Club movement. She was really active in that regard. Those were clubs that were really established to really, there's a saying, lifting as we climb. So women of color who were in positions of influence came together to do programs, establish agencies and organizations that were really geared towards lifting the entire race. She was really involved in that regard, really influential in things like the NAACP. They hosted a lot of fundraisers at their house, as Chad was saying. We're always housing and entertaining leaders in the Black community who came to Cleveland to visit, to talk, or those kinds of things. So I think Susan was as important as Charles, but she didn't get as much attention because she wasn't the one writing all the letters to the editor.
Gotcha. Okay, and we have about a minute and a half to get them in. So please, step up.
Hello, my name is Myla, and based on his past books and articles, I want to know, how you think he would feel about us have had a Black president?
Oh, that's a great question. I think he would be really happy about that. I think he would have said that it took too long. But I think he would have been really pleased with what Barack Obama was able to accomplish as the first Black president. I think he would have been very happy.
And maybe been an advisor.
Yes, absolutely. He would have told Barack Obama exactly what he should be doing and how.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name
Good
is
afternoon.
My question was, do you feel like Charles Chesnutt, his ideas and views on race will be accepted in today's world?
Good question. I think so. I think that, as you probably noted from the quote that I read at the beginning of my talk, what he had to say about race is really relevant for what's happening today. So I think it's important for all of you to really read the things that he had to say, because I think it's instructive. I think that he has some really good ideas about how we should go about achieving equality of the races. It's really, really relevant for today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's an awesome question.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Brianna. I wanted to know, how big of a role would you say Charles played in trying to prohibit segregation?
I think that he would say that he wishes that he could have been more influential. He was, the things that he had to say to, about race was really influential in the colored community at the time. And whites who were sympathetic to the cause, but it really was just too much for the average white person at the time. He was really seen as kind of radical, in some ways more radical than Du Bois at the time. Again, like I said to the other question, I think that what he had to say is really relevant. I think we still have a lot of things that we can do to achieve equality. And he's got some really good ideas about how we can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, good question.
Thank you for your questions, really good questions, and for your presence as well. It's been a great pleasure to have you with us in this studio. And we are out of time now, and this concludes the Black History Month series from the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation. Thank you for being part of it. Enjoy your lunch and travel safely.